presentation.
Give me 1 second here to bring it up. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that okay. Yes, no?
You're good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, as I said, I'm John DePlanche. You probably have seen me in the room listed just as John D. I'm usually lurking in the background, not saying too much, but I've been hanging around this group for a couple of years now. Been doing one type of light show or another for about 10 years now. So I go way back to some of the old controllers and how to do that. So I've got a good background in it. My light shows aren't the best because I'm not the most creative when it comes to these things, but I get them set up and I'm happy with it. And that's what really counts in this hobby is you do what makes you happy. So I'm going to go a little bit more into the setup tab and XLates, but basically more of the terminology rather than trying to get a particular show set up. Basically, the first thing I'm going to start with is the different type of output types that there are. And most of your old controllers were serial type devices. Back when computers had serial ports built into them, that's what you would use. Nowadays, we really don't have too many serial connections on computers anymore. There's a few that might have them, but usually you use some type of USB dongle to connect to those to make those older type of controllers work. Those older controllers were usually used with AC type lighting because that's all there was back then. Some of them are used with thumb node controllers. There's very limited support for the smart node controllers. And basically that's because these old serial devices can't really output that many channels on them. They can do maybe 512, not much more than that. That's what we consider a universe. That's what the old ones, or where universe came from, was these old devices that output 512. A lot of the actual controllers, though, are limited to much more than that. They can be daisy chained together to output that many, but one controller on its own often can't do that. Some of these old serial devices run several different types of protocol that are out there. DMX is probably the most popular and widely used. It's used often for stage lighting, for production companies. When you go see a play or something like that, that was the system that they used. Most common, most commercial that is out there. Lightorama is another one, LOR, it's often abbreviated in here. You'll hear people talking about that. I think many people are moving over slowly from Lightorama into XLights and other type of controllers that are out there. But if you're not from that, when we're talking LOR, that's what we're talking about. That was a commercial operation, still is a commercial operation that runs basically Christmas controllers for the hobbyist, some professional type shows, but not really running your production companies or theaters or anything like that. The other two that are listed here, Renard and PixelNet, those are more DIY type boards that you used to be able, and still can in some instances, go online, join a co-op, they'd send you a board, they'd send you all the parts, you'd solder it up together, build it yourself, and you'd have something that could run. That saved you on cost from some of these more professional type things because you did it all yourself. A lot of fun to solder those things up, but it was a lot of parts that you had to do. Some people didn't have the capabilities to do that, some did. Some of these you can get commercially still that are knockoffs or close to those. You can find a lot of the old versions still being sold online. These boards generally, like I said before, are your AC type controllers or your dumb string type controllers. PixelNet was one of the early ones that got into the RGB type with smart string and that. Down on the bottom left side is a Lynx controller. You'll hear people talking about some of those, and the little pipe bomb looking things that were smart string controllers that were just very small individual things that you had to plug in. These are all still supported through XLates, which is very nice because if you have any of this old stuff, you can still use it. part of my show still use both DMX and PixelNet because I just don't want to get rid of that and change over to something new when they're all perfectly good. As Matt explained earlier, there's a place in your show for all of these different things. So don't think just because you're switching over, you have to get rid of it. I find it's better to add to, and then as these things break, you can replace them as needed rather than just replacing all at once. When you're going to add something like this to XLates, you add it through your USB. This is on your setup tab. You click the add USB. It'll bring up a little bit of a window that asks you some questions. Basically, you just fill that out based on what type of controller you have. I'm not going to go through all the different types here that are listed. I'm listed what I think are the top 4 most popular. You fill that in based on the type of connection that you had for that controller, how you're connecting it to the computer, what the baud rate is. You'll see here I have listed or highlighted the baud rate there. When you're using a USB type controller, this is the baud rate that gets filled out. Some of these are set automatically, some like Bernard are not. So you'd have to look at your documentation for that controller to fill that out properly. LOR, depending on how many channels you use, the baud rate changes, and that can affect how many channels that you can have on there. All of these USB type connections, there is no universe defined for that. All of them use absolute channels. I'm going to get into that a little bit later, the difference between absolute addressing and universe. But keep in mind, all of these do not have a universe assigned. They're just based on channels. Because of that, I usually like starting those at the lower channels. You'll see here I've got a DMX controller starting at channel 1, going to channel 32. I've put some others in order here just to kind of fill it up, but whatever I do, I usually keep these at the beginning just so they're easier to find and more logical, because these devices usually only will support up to 512 channels. It's a lot less math to figure out where they are, where they're going, and I can just hook them up this way. One other thing I will note with these is you only have to add these as USB if you're actually physically connecting these devices to your computer that's running your show. If you're connecting it to another device, another controller, an FPP, Falcon controller, some of the other ones that are available out there that have USB slots or serial output ports, you wouldn't define it in XLates for that. Then you would define it as an E131, and your other controller makes the conversion to this old type of system for you. Certain ones can do it, certain ones can't. It depends on what type of controller you buy. So if you're trying to use your old stuff, do a little research, make sure whatever you buy supports your old hardware if you still want to continue to use it. The next one I'm going to talk about, it's not exactly in order, but it's on the setup tab, is add Null. Null basically gives you the ability to go in and add channels to your XLates program to get started working with some models in there, but it's not actually adding a controller. So it's really good for laying things out when you want to mess around with things, get familiar with the program. You can kind of see how channels work and what to do and not to do, but it's not actually physically adding universes or too much information. What I hear a lot of people have done it for, and I personally don't have any P10 panels, but I hear it's good if you want to use P10 panels that use a lot of channels. You put that in there, and then since it knows it's not connected, if you're doing any testing with other things connected, keep your P10 panels on a null, and you're not trying to put out all that network traffic on there. I'm sure we're going to have another presentation at some point that talks about setting up P10 panels, what you do with all of those. Someone will go through this in a lot more detail, but that's what the add null is on there. Now I'm going to go into the adding E131. E131 and ArtNet are very similar type protocols. They're not identical, but they're very similar. So I'm just going to talk about the E131 as opposed to the ArtNet, just because I think that's more commonly used. They're very similar. Almost all of your modern Pixel controllers, which are basically your smart string type controllers, will use E131 as a protocol. What that is it plugs into a network port either on your computer, on your FPP, which is a Falcon Pi player, and that takes network traffic and sends it to your controller. Your controller then translates that into what the lights need to be able to blink and flash like you want them to. These are typically done with smart strings only. There are very few, if any, dumb string controllers that will take E131, and I think maybe only one or two that will do AC over that. That's because the push is everybody's going to the RGB type controllers because you want to be able to control each individual little pixel, not turn on strings of lights anymore. So that's why you're going to see this is probably the most popular, most widely used, especially for what we're doing. As I said, it's the E131 is just the name of the protocol. It uses an Ethernet connection. That's the typical cables that you're using for plugging your computers into your modem or your router to be able to make everything work. Pretty common way to do it. The IP address, when you bring up a screen, it's going to allow you to assign a unique, I'm going to call it a unique name for each controller, but it's really a series of 4 sets of 3 digits on there, up to 3 digits on there. There's several different ways that you can do this and set it up. I'm not going to go into how to set up your networking. I know that's going to be another class on here coming up. I'm just giving you the basics to know that each of your controllers should have a unique name. You don't want to have 2 with the same name because there's no way to differentiate what the 2 different controllers are if they have the same exact name. It's just like George Foreman has all his kids named George. How do you know which one he's talking to unless he talks to them by age or which one was born first or something like that? So don't do that. Name them all the same. You're going to get very confused. Call them all something different. In the example here, the first 3 digits are all the same, 192.168.10, because I'm using that as my show network. Then each controller that I have on here is the last digit on there, 1, 2, and 3. I'm keeping it very simple for this example. If you have a lot of controllers, you can use a lot more. Maybe you want to start at 10 instead of 1. That's all up to you. You just want to keep them individual. There are other numbers that you can use instead of the 192.168.10. Again, I'm not going to get into that. That's going to be another presentation. I am going to talk a little bit about the universe and output ports a little bit as we go through here. But keep in mind that every controller is what decides how many universes and how many output ports there are on it. There is nothing that is universal about how many each controller will do. It's up to the manufacturer of that board, how much they can put out. Cheaper controllers are going to have less, more expensive are going to have more. That's generally how everything works. But keep in mind, more universes and more output ports doesn't necessarily mean a better controller. It just means they're able to handle a lot more. That may not be suitable for what you actually need. So don't just look at it and say, hey, this has got the most universes on this. It's got the most output ports. That's what I need. If you're not going to power inject and you want to keep things simple, that may not be the way you want to go. Again, take a look at what you actually need and what you want to use. Up near the top here, there's a link to the XLates webpage on the resources. If you click on that or just go to this, there's a comparison of a bunch of different types of 16-port RGB pixel controllers on there. I think some of them listed on there are not only 16. I think there's some 4 or other ones on there. But it's a great resource that tries to compare everything and gives you a lot of information on that. When you do go to the site, you'll notice that there is probably only 3 or 4 that show up immediately on there. But if you scroll down to the bottom of the screen, there's a sliding bar that can go over to the side, and you'll see probably 16 or 20 different controllers that are all compared on there. And XLates supports all of them. This is the E131 setup page. I've been talking a little bit about some of this as we've been going through with the universes, IP address, and that. The first thing I'm going to talk about here, though, is the method of connection, Unicast versus Multicast, and what the difference is. Multicast is basically when you're sending out all of the information to all of the controllers, and then the controllers decide what they're going to hear. A good analogy that I've heard about this is basically you have a teacher standing in front of a classroom, and he's talking to everyone, and everyone is hearing the exact same information. They take it all in, and they do what they want with it. The information is sent out. If each controller has a different universe number or several universe numbers, they only care about that particular information coming to them. The rest of the information is disregarded. Because of that, each controller needs to have a unique universe number to be able to use that information properly. If you set the universe number on all of these the same, everything's going to do the exact same thing. Your light show is not going to look very good if you do that. When you get into Unicast, rather than standing up in front of a classroom and talking to everyone, it's like somebody going over to one person and just whispering to them the information that they need. Because of this, you're much more refined on what you're giving, and you don't need to be sending it out to each one. Reduces the network traffic a little bit, kind of keeps things a little bit more concise, and it makes things a little bit simpler. Keep in mind too that you're going to be doing this to all of your controllers. You're not just going to be setting up Unicast for one controller and talking to that. It's just you're going to be individually whispering to each of them going through. So it's not a huge reduction in the amount of communication. It just isn't sending everything to every particular controller. Again, there is no real right way or wrong way to do this. There's many ways you can do this. If you were on earlier, Ed says there's 5 ways to do everything. That's not quite true with this. There's only 2. I think you'll find more people use Unicast than Multicast, just because it's a little bit easier to see where things are going, but there's nothing wrong with either one of them, and use what suits your needs. So that was a brief overview on that. Again, there's going to be another session on networking that'll get into more of that in the future. So now I'm going to talk, I've been talking about universes a little bit, and if you watch The Big Bang at all, you've heard him say, in what universe are we talking about here? Well, we're not talking about the real universe that we're all living in. We're talking about something a little bit different. A universe we define here is a group of up to 512 channels. It originated from the DMX protocol, like I was talking about before. They pretty much came up with that's how many different channels they could control, and it was mainly used on AC type lighting way back in the day because that's what was most popular. All these RGB lights weren't nearly as popular as they are today, especially for the hobbyist. So we still use that same terminology and the 512 limit for any particular universe that we do. It can be less than 512 channels. 512 is the maximum. It can be anything from 1 channel up to 512 channels. You'll hear a lot of discussion going on about why do we use 510 versus 512. The reason that a lot of people use 510 is because it's divisible by 3 into a whole number. As Matt was saying earlier, for your dumb strings, you have 3 channels for the entire string. For smart strings, you have 3 channels per pixel. Both of those use the number 3. That's what you want to be able to divide by. So the 510 gives you 170 pixels total. 512, if you divide that, you get 170.67. You can't divide that evenly up if you're trying to control something. So if you put 500 or 171 pixels on one particular string with only one universe being able to control it, that last element is never going to have the last color turn on, and it's always going to be a different color. You'd have to have at least 2 universes going out to be able to control 171 pixels. That's why some people will stop it at 510 so they can't accidentally cross that line. There is nothing wrong in general with putting 512 on there and using that as long as you do it everywhere. You want to make sure that you're consistent both in XLates and your controllers with what you're doing. If you're using 510 in one, you have to use 510 in the other. If you don't and use 512 on one and 510 on the other, you're going to have different colors showing up on your tree. Mainly when, or not tree, but your lights, when you walk out there and look at it, you're going to go, these colors are all off. What's wrong? Generally speaking, first thing you look at, make sure all your universes are identified exactly the same. One thing caveat I will put on all this, there are some older controllers that do have a limit of 510 themselves. That's built into them, that you can only use 510. Similarly, on P10 type panels, those panels are 16 by 32 for the number of pixels that are on there. When you multiply that together and figure out how many channels that is, that comes out to 512, and you need to put 3 universes of that on there. So typically, if you're using P10 panels, you want to have a 512 sized universe. But for all of the other controllers that don't have a set limit or are not use P10, you can use either one, or you can use something much less. Personally, I try to stick to something that's easily divisible by 3, but there is no need to have to do that, again, as long as you're consistent. For uploading these two, for being able to make sure you do that, when you're on your setup screen, if you right-click, you can upload to your controller this port, and it will tell you, it will upload to your controller or to FPP, so you don't make any mistakes trying to type that in. A lot of people make mistakes typing this in, just fat fingers trying to do it on a keyboard. You make a mistake, you get a 511 or a 501 when you're trying to type 510. Common error, so always check, check, check when you're doing that type of stuff. Another thing when you're getting into universes is not the first column on the setup tab. This is the number of the controller, or the number that goes in this, and it's used only by XLates and in some rare cases when you're trying to mix different things together. That first column is not your universe. Keep that in mind. Your universe number you identify, and it gets shown in the green box that I have there towards the middle of the screen. That is the universe number. For here, I made it stand out a little bit more uniquely by calling them 101, 102, and that, so you can see the difference between a number that's always going to be sequential over on the left-hand side versus the number I'm assigning that's in the middle of the screen there. Also, your universe number is not your output port number on the controller. They can be the same, but they do not have to be the same. There is a difference because many controller ports will output multiple universes. So if you're always thinking, well, universe 1 has to go to output 1, universe 2 has to go to output 2, you'd only ever need 16 universes on a 16-port channel. Well, a lot of the 16-port channels can do 48 or 96 universes. What are you going to do with all the others? Well, you use them on some of your other ports as you're going through. So if you'll see over on the right-hand side where it says description, a lot of people will put a description of what is connected there to your particular output port. Personally, I do not do that because that information you can define later what output port's connected to it. Here, I just put a description of my controller. Here it's controller 1, so I just put that. You don't have to do that if you want to connect it, so you know what's going to each universe, put whatever you want in there. But keep in mind that it's not just one universe per output channel for that. Now I'm going to get a little bit into addressing modes, and I think a lot of people get very confused on this. If you give me one moment here, my dogs just walked into the room. Okay, back now. Okay, addressing modes, there's 2 different types of addressing modes that can be used that we're going to talk about. The first is absolute addressing, and that's when every channel gets its own unique number. It basically starts at the number 1 for your first channel and increments up for there. Back in the old days when you're only using AC channels, you might have had a couple hundred. The big shows had a few thousand channels. We did not have things like XLates that were scheduling all these RGB things. We had other type of software that was a grid type thing. You weren't going to be sequencing thousands and thousands of channels in there very efficiently. So absolute addressing was pretty much all you had. It was really good for these low channel counts. Easily understandable. You didn't need anything to do. If you're coming from old software or hardware, you're probably most familiar with absolute addressing. You don't know what a universe is or why you would ever need to use it. When we start talking about universes, what that is doing, it's taking groups of these channels and it's breaking them up into smaller groups, which we call universes. This makes it much easier to manage the higher channel counts because you don't have to think about, oh, I've got a particular channel that's 70,462. I'm in a certain thing on a certain channel number on a particular universe. It's a little bit tricky to learn, but once you get the hang of it, you can easily locate your channels. It also makes it much more easy to configure and manage things if you have to add channels in later. There's been a lot of people that have talked about this in a lot of different ways. I know last week, Ron talked about buckets being universes and how that could be done. A few weeks ago, Keith talked about addressing from one end of the country to the other going down Route 66. Well, I'm going to talk about it using a slightly different analogy here, just in case you didn't understand those. If you understand it, great. If not, hopefully this will help you a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say XLates is basically like a stadium. We just built a stadium with all the donations that everybody's been so gracious to build, and it's a very configurable stadium. This stadium can meet the needs of the concert, which is your light show. We're building it right outside your house. So when the excavators are out there in the next few days, don't be surprised. We can seat a lot of people in this, or we can just have a couple hundred seats. We could even have 1 or 2 seats, or we can build thousands and thousands of seats out in front of your house. The addressing mode is simply how we're going to number those seats that we're putting in this stadium. If we talk about absolute addressing, all the seats are numbered sequentially. We start at 1 and we go up to the maximum number of seats that we have in the stadium. That works. That's how you count how many seats you do. You go to any football stadium, they can tell you, we've got 70,000 seats and it was a sellout this year. Well, that's great. When you get that many seats in XLights, it gets a little bit confusing. Universe channel, basically you order or you organize your seats by particular section that you're working with. So when you get a ticket to come to XLights Stadium, apparently things got a little bit confused, but on the left-hand side is our absolute type addressing. If you got a ticket to a particular stadium and it told you that you were seating in channel, or you were seating in seat 50,792, you would have a very hard time finding that seat. That's a lot of numbers to remember. You're going to be walking around. You have no idea where that particular seat is. When you go over on the right-hand side and you see Universe 10, Channel 300, well, that's the same thing as saying you're seating in Section 10, Channel 300. That's a little bit easier to tell where you got to go if you're walking into a stadium to sit down. Same thing, Universe, section number, channel, seat number, very similar type concept. And I'm going to kind of run with that a little bit here to show you a little bit more graphically here. First, we're going to start and say we just have one particular universe, only 512 seats in this particular stadium that we're doing. In that case, there only would be one universe, one seat, and we're going to locate channel or seat 300, channel 300. Pretty easy to find. Seat 300, universe 1, seat 100, very identical thing that we're looking at. When we go into 2 universes, if we were sitting in the second section at seat 300, then we're looking at seat 812. And the reason is the first section of 512 has already been filled, and then we're going 300 into the second section to find our seat. Still, really not too complicated to be able to figure that out. We've only got 2 universes. We could count the seats either way that we want to. This is why either method is really good for low channel counts. You can handle it pretty well. We start getting into something higher where we get 10 universes. If you had to start from the beginning and count seats and you had to go to seat 5420, it'd take you a while to figure that out, or even just to look up at a map. Well, where is that going to be in here? But if I told you you were in the 10th section 300, you can look at this pretty quickly, identify where you're located. This is one of the benefits of using this. These, instead of sections, are your universes. They can be associated with certain props in your yard. It makes it pretty easy to identify it, especially when you have a problem or you're testing things, what's going on where, without trying to remember these very long numbers. Generally speaking, the human mind can comprehend digits in groups of 3 and 4 very quickly and very easily. When you start getting into numbers that are 5 digits or longer, it gets more complicated for you to remember. That's why your social security number, your phone numbers, things like that, they're all typically done in groups of 3 or 4. So going back to the setup tab here, when we're looking at things, just to complete the analogy to some extent, the IP address that's listed over here is the level of the stadium that we have. XLates allows you to have many levels, many different controllers in your particular stadium. We can keep adding and adding and adding. We don't just have to have one. We can add a lot of controllers over there. The next row, that's your universe number, E131 universe. That's the section that you're seating on that particular level. The next over, your channel number. That's how many seats you're going to have in that section. We were talking before, it can be up to 512. I used 510 for this example because, like I said, I like it divisible by 3, but that's a personal preference. But these can be something much lower. I might have certain sections where I only have 210 or 250 channels. Doesn't matter what it is. When you get over to this next column, this is just telling you what your absolute channel number is there. So it's a running total of how many channels that you have used in this particular stadium. So if this was all we were using in our stadium, we'd have 3,060 seats there. But we've broken it down into 6 sections so you can quickly find your seat rather than trying to figure out these longer type numbers. As things get bigger and bigger, it gets much easier to use universe start channel, in my opinion. Not everybody will agree with that, but that's what I'm trying to show here is the different ways that you can do things. Not necessarily say one's better than the other. Whatever you understand, that's what you should go with. So going back to the stadium here, this is picture a map of the first level on a particular stadium that you're going to. Again, this is being built outside your house to watch your light show this year. So watch for the cranes and excavators and guys with the hard hats coming around. Here, we're gonna have one controller, one level. We've got 16 different sections. Each of them has the same number of channels. Very easy to figure out what's going on there. This next slide, I've basically just shown what the seat numbers are in those particular channels. If I told you you got to go to any particular seat 6,000 for example, it takes you a little bit of a while to look around, see where 6,000 is. If I tell you go to section 113, seat 100, you can probably find that a lot easier. That's all we're trying to do is simplify things for you because we already have those groups set up. Again, the sections are the same as the buckets that were previously talked about, the universes, all the same types of thing. As I said before, our sections do not have to have the same number of seats in them. Here, all I did was change this row here, the number of channels, into something a little bit different. Certain sections are going to be larger compared to other sections because this one has 510, this one only has, or these two only have 450, down to 210 or 90 here. Doesn't matter how many we have, the analogy still works the same. The bigger the section, the more channels it has. We're only capped that we can only have a maximum of 512 per section, and however many sections, which is determined by the controller. The 512 is a hard limit for any controller that you can find. There's nothing that goes beyond that per universe the way XLates talks to them at this time. This just shows it a little bit bigger detail for those that might not have been able to see it before. If we're going too fast on any of this, I do apologize, but this is all being recorded and will be available on XLate or videos.xlate.org in the future, and then you can pause it and take a little bit of a better look at it. A little bit more about universe and controllers. As I said, the maximum universe size is 512. That's a kind of an industry standard. That's what XLates uses. You're not going to get away from that. The maximum number of universes that you have per controller is determined by whoever manufactured that controller. Higher number of universes means that you can output more channels out of that. However, when you get to too many universes or too many channels per output, it may slow down a little bit there. So you can't get as many frames per second as you can when you're using a lower channel count. You have to look at the particular controller to see how many they can do at the speed that you're wanting to do. Take a look at that when you're looking at your controller. More universes, more channels does not necessarily always mean the same thing. Different vendors have different things, and different people will give you recommendations on that outside of this if you want that. The maximum number of controllers that can be connected is determined by XLights, and that's basically based on the number of channels that you're going to use. I don't know how many that is offhand. I know the developers are usually hanging out in here. They could probably answer it in chat if you want to. But if you're new to the hobby, you're not going to have a problem with this. There have been some very, very large light shows put on, controlled by XLights, and they have not exceeded the number of controllers that could be used on here. Unless you're actually trying to sequence an entire football stadium or something to that effect, I don't think you're going to have a problem. Once you're getting into something even remotely close to that size, you're going to understand all this much better. So don't worry about having too many controllers connected or too many levels in the stadium that I'm talking about here. So let's add a little bit more complexity to this stadium. Before, what I was talking about, we had one controller, and if you look at the bottom, hopefully it shows up, the blue level is my controller 1, and I've put 24 universes or sections on that controller. Well, now I'm going to say, well, I want to use a second controller because I need things a little bit more spread out. I add controller 2, which is my orange section, onto there, and I've also put 24 universes on that. I can add a third. I can add 4, 5, 6. I didn't add them all here, but you can see it's just like a stadium, which is why I use the analogy there. You can keep going and going and going with as many levels as you need for as many controllers as you have. Anything that has its own IP address, that's its own level in your particular stadium. You'll notice here, I've changed things up a little. You don't have to have the same number of universes on any particular controller. You'll see my first controller here, I've got 24 sections as you come around. That's 24 universes on this controller. The next one, I'm using a maximum of 216. The next, or not 216, it'd be 16 because it starts at 201. The next one I'm using 48 because it starts at 1, goes through 48. They don't have to be the same. They don't have to line up in any way. They're all independent from one another. You can call them whatever you want to. You can use as many as you need for this. It's the number that you can put as your maximum on any level. Again, is defined by your controller. It's not defined by XLates. As far as I'm aware, there's none that can do more than 96 at this time. Just the way that people have made them, that's what it works out. Because of that, the numbering system here, you'll see that I've gone for every different level. I've started with a number being 101, 201, 301, and I'd keep going up and up from there. You can, in theory, put, or in practice, start each controller with universe number 1 if you wanted to. Each controller has its own IP address. If you send it out unicast to that particular controller, you can start with channel 1 on controller 1, or universe 1, channel 1 on controller 1. And then you can go to universe 1, channel 1 on controller 2, as I'm showing over here on the right-hand side. If you do this, however, you'll notice that if I say we're going to go to universe 1, I have to tell you which controller we're on because it's not easily identifiable just from that information, universe 1, which controller I'm on. If you go on the left side here, when I've said section 101, there's only one section 101 in the stadium. There's only section 1, or only one section 201 in the stadium. It makes it easier to figure things out, and if you may have a mistake somewhere. When you're going through your models, when you're going through your controllers and setting things up, you can very easily tell where things are on this. There's a couple of guys that are fairly regular on the forums and on these Wednesday night calls and that have some spreadsheets that kind of do the same type of thing. I've just put in a little bit more of a graphical form on here. I would recommend that you do it the way on the left so that each one has its own start channel when you're going through the different levels. You don't have to do that, but it's much easier to figure things out when you do have a problem, if you have some problems on there. But you do not have to. If you want to start over at the same time on different universe on each controller, you can do so. Keep in mind, however, that if you are sending it out via multicast, then each one has to have its own number, like shown on the left-hand side here. If you're showing it on the right-hand side here, no controller is going to know which one is on one. It's going to get confused. It's not going to work for you. When you're using multicast, each universe has to be unique. If you're using Unicast, it doesn't have to be unique. Multicast has to be unique. Unicast does not have to be unique. Here basically is just showing the numbering system here. When I had port number, my IP address for controller 1 comes down up to 124. Then I change it over here to 201. These numbers do not have to be sequential. They do not have to be in order or consecutive. They can be anything you want to in any fashion whatsoever. However, keep in mind that some of your controllers do have limits on how they're used, and if you start putting them not in order or mixing things up too much, things may not be working the way you expect them to. So pay attention with your particular controller when you set that up. Going to get into even more on this because I was talking about how the number of universes is not the same as the number of output ports. The number of output ports is determined by what type of controller that you have. And this can vary anywhere from a single universe on some of these smaller controllers, maybe on something like a Pi cap, up to 48, which I know when you're using some of these new boards that are out there with expansion boards, you can have 48 different outputs being on there. They have 96 universes that can be output to these different controllers. 96 universes on 48 outputs means you can have 2 universes per output port. However, if you're only using 16, you can get 6 universes per output port. So that all depends on your particular controller. And the number of output ports, as I said, that's also determined on there. Pi cap or Pi hat usually only has 2 output ports. There are 4 and 16 ones also pretty readily available out there. And again, keep in mind the number of universes per output port is determined by the controller. And the more universes that go out each output port, the slower things may get for you, so you may not be able to do as fast speeds on there. So I'm going to go back to the kind of stadium analogy and show you one again here. I'm going to simplify it and just go back to one controller level on there because it makes it easier to understand. This particular case, I'm putting the 512 channels per universe, or that's how many seats per section. I'm going to have 24 universes on there, but this time I'm going to also show that I have 16 output ports. Configure output ports just like the exits to the stadium. However many universes can go out each one is how many people can get out a particular area. If we try to cram too many people going out any particular exit, they slow down, they get stuck in there even longer. In real life, that means you're just inconvenienced. When you're doing your show, that means things aren't flashing as fast as you'd like them to. There's a little bit of lag, so we don't want to do that. We want to keep that as small as possible, generally speaking. So here I've got it set up so that my first 8 ports are each using 1 universe per port. My next 8 ports are using 2 universes per port. Pretty simple to do, pretty simple to understand what's going where. Port 1 is all the universe or data that's on universe 101. Port 2, 102. You follow it along. Port 9 is 109 and 110. Port 10 is 111 and 12. Kind of just as a visual example of what's going on here. Now, a lot of times you're not going to have the exact size that you need for your particular port. My universe may be larger or smaller than the amount of information that I need on that particular output port. You'll see here 101 is my full universe, but port 1 is using most, but not all of that. As we come along, you'll see the lines for our particular ports are partway through universes. There's nothing wrong with doing that, and all the information will get to where you want it to be. And this, in fact, is commonly referred to as pixel packing. This is when you're starting your next particular port where you've left off on the last one. This way you have no wasted channels, no wasted seats in your stadium. Nothing is blank. You've packed everybody in there as tight as you can get to. Now you'll see I've got a little bit of a gray area up here. These are unused ones for my particular scenario here. I didn't use these. I didn't need all of Universe 124. I only needed the first few channels in section 124 to be used with this. So what I can do is I can go in there. Right now, all 24 of these universes, we're at 512. I can go in there and I can remove the extra ones that I don't need so that 124 is just a very small universe now. Now I've made my file size or my seat perfect for the amount of channels that I need. It's fully pixel packed, if you will. It makes for the smallest file size that you can have when you're running your show. It makes it very efficient to be used, but you can't quickly identify where your start and end of your ports are. For example, port 9 here starts in the middle of universe 108. I don't know exactly where, but somewhere there. You can't see where exactly that is. Port 15 starts in the middle of 120. You have to figure out with some math or paying attention to your files where those start and ends are going to be. What a lot of people will do is they will adjust all the universe sizes so that they fit in this a little bit better. Here we've adjusted some of these so that again, it looks very similar to a few slides ago where all of port 1 is on 101, all port 2 is on 102. You can adjust all of these to be whatever size you need to fill that out. Right now, there is some subtle differences between these, but you can't see them because they all have very large channel counts, relatively speaking. So over here, I'm going to go where I've got things that are much different channel size. Port 1 is using most of the 510 channels on it because it's a very large universe. Ports 3 and 4, however, aren't using as much. Port 1 might have a very large element, for example, in my actual show, running something like a arch or that. When I get over to port 4, maybe I'm just running a little 10 node star, something very small. You can adjust these all so that they're what you need to get things out of it. When we get over into port 9 and 10, we can adjust them a little bit differently too. For Universe 109, I've kept that at the maximum size and then adjusted port 10 to what I need for there. That's one way of doing it. Another, on port 10, it's the same total number of channels if you combine 111 and 112 as the combination of 109 and 110. But instead of making one large and one small, I divided them up evenly. Either way works. It's depending on however you want to do it, what makes the most sense to you. But as you see, it's the same as we previously did, just dividing them up so that you can easily see that each port starts on its own universe. It would start on universe 121, channel 1 for port 15. When we get to port 16, universe 123, channel 1. It just makes it easier to spot things, to find where they're going a lot of times. This is why you'll find a lot of people liking to use universe start channel for things. You can easily also add and subtract universes when you're doing this. If you find that you need to add something in here, you can add a universe in here or add a section to your stadium. Doesn't have to be in numerical order. It's easier if it is, but if it's not, it doesn't really mess things up. When you use absolute start channels, that's not really the case. All the numbers are redone through there, and you have to essentially go back, reprogram all of those different numbers. Just want to point out too, pixel packing is not needed. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. If you have a relatively large show and you don't care about your file sizes, you don't have to do it. However, if you go into tools and check sequence and run that, one of the warnings that they give you will tell you when you have large blocks of unused channels and that maybe you should try to eliminate some of this. Again, you don't have to. This is just what it's telling you can do. What that means visually is when we're going through our stadium here, these red sections, let's say I had planned on all of these being used for 3 universes for each of these particular ports. Well, when I started putting things together, I ran out of time, I ran out of lights. I wasn't able to do that for my last 4 ports here. I only had enough pixels to run 2 universes of information off of them, maybe a little bit less. So I didn't use the last port in each of these. So they're kind of being wasted channels that we've defined on there. When you run the check sequence, it's going to tell me that I have a large block of unused channels between this. In our stadium, that's a large block of unsold seats. Rather than having empty stadiums, seats in our stadium that looks awful when we go to show it, we can simply remove them if we want to. Like I said, our stadium is highly configurable. We can go through, we can add and we can remove seats no matter what we want to do. We can leave them there. We don't care if it's there. We still have the seats. We still have to clean them off if they get covered in snow, but it's no real harm. Or we can eliminate them all. Whatever you want to do is fine. That's just what that warning is trying to tell you on there. So in closing, I know I covered a lot here. Hopefully it makes sense to you, but I want to just go over a couple of points here with you. The biggest thing you have to do when setting up any type of universe and start channels and your controllers is make sure that you're consistent. Make sure XLates and all your controllers, including your FPP, use the same universe size on any particular universe. If you're going to make them different sizes, 510, 210, 30, 90, whatever it is, they have to be the same for each universe you've defined on everything that you're using. Otherwise, you will run into problems. XLates has tools. One of them is FPP Connect for the upload, or there's a controller upload. Use those whenever you can to do it. It'll make your life a lot simpler. But knowing what they're doing is also beneficial, which is part of the reason we're doing this. Another recommendation I have is either use absolute channel or universe start channel. Don't use both if you can avoid it at all. It makes life easier for you just to be able to look at it and go, okay, everything I have is in absolute, everything I have is in universe start channel. One of the biggest problems that you'll see people on here asking for help with is they don't know what channel number they're on because they've used a little bit of each. It's very difficult to help somebody with something like that when they have that, because nobody that's on here looking at their system can figure it out quickly and easily. So if you want help, pick one or the other. We can usually figure it out. A lot of people on here do like the universe start channel, but we also understand absolute, so we can help you. When you have a mix of them, it makes it take that much longer. It's less people we can help out, and it makes it more difficult for you because we're going to tell you, you've got to change this, this, and this. If you're starting from the beginning, pick one, go with it. And as the next point says, use what makes sense to you, not what somebody else tells you what to do. In here, I've talked a lot about universe and start channel. I like that. I've converted over to that this year only. I used to always use absolute. I think universe start channel makes a lot more sense. That's why I covered it more. Absolute also, though, is very valid. Relatively easy to understand because it starts from 1 and goes to your total number that you need. But you'll see people in here in any of the help sessions tell people, well, you should change this. Well, if you're only comfortable with using one or the other, go with that. And if you have to tell somebody, no, I don't want to make that change, don't make that change. Don't let somebody talk you into it if you don't really need to, especially if you're just having a minor problem. Do what makes you comfortable and what you understand. Another point, use tools check sequence. That will tell you if you have problems. Sometimes when you're typing these things in, you'll get 2 universes with the same number on the same controller. You'll get the gaps of open channels in that. Use tools check sequence. It will help identify some of these for you and see what's going on there. And the last thing we want to say is don't forget to donate if at all possible. If you can afford it, we would appreciate it. Keeping the software going does cost money for these guys to be able to do things. Keeping these training sessions open so that we can get the 100 people in here. And I don't know if we've been upgraded to 200 or not, but we're trying to do that. All that does cost money. That's what donations are going to help. Even if we get a few cents from everybody every week to keep this open so that we can get 200 people in here, it makes it better for everybody. So that's all I have on that. I know we went a little bit long here, and I apologize for that, but I hope you did learn something with it. I'm going to end my recording of this and stop sharing, but I'd be happy to take any questions here. And then if we don't have any, or if we want to get into more detail, I'd be happy to go out into a breakout room with anybody if you need to. So thank you very much, and thank you for Matt for the great introduction.
The XLates project exists because of people like you. Help continue the project by making a donation today at xlates.org/donate.